This is Doug McIntyre, the editor at ClimateCrisis247, and David Calloway from London, who's the second editor of Climate Crisis 247. We're going to spend some time talking about the Biden administration's new plan to lower car emissions, which really require over 50% of the new cars sold in the United States by early in the next decade for it to work. So, David, explain first, what are the rules? What are the new rules?
Well, they've basically reduced the amount of emissions that your normal gas-powered cars can emit, Doug. And so that is going to, in a way, force automakers to push either to quickly adjust their cars and make them hybrids at the very least, or to push electric vehicles. And it's really kind of a way of trying to shift the electric vehicle burden onto the automakers after we've seen consumer sales of electric vehicles slowing quickly. And this is the type of thing that Democratic administrations have done for decades. California does it in its state. It's a leading promoter of lower emission standards. And, obviously lower emissions are better for the climate. But whether you can actually get people to do it and whether you can get it through a reluctant Congress, which bristles every time anything mentions climate change, is another story altogether.
So let's look at some of the hurdles. Let's start with the election. Nobody knows who's going to win the election, but if Trump wins the election, it seems to me that all of this goes away.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, in a way, Biden is doing it as an election gambit, right? He wants to play his card as the climate change guy. He needs to attract the youth vote to win. And the youth vote cares about climate change. So he's going to play that card, knowing that if Trump wins, it's out the window. And frankly, playing the card doesn't hurt anything because there's going to be lawsuits which are going to stall it until the election anyway. When this came out yesterday, I immediately looked. It was hailed as this giant boon for electric vehicles. So I looked at some of the electric vehicle stocks, and they weren't really moving. Some of them, like Tesla, moved after the Fed's rate decision, but most of them weren't moving, and that's because investors realize that this is not going to happen short term.
One of the things that was mentioned a lot in the news coverage of this is that you'll see Republican state attorneys general, for political reasons mostly, file suits. And, to put it in a simple way, it's the people in our state should be able to decide what they want to drive. If we get a dozen of these states filing suits, I assume it makes it a harder hill to climb for the Democrats.
Well, it just delays it until the election, right? That's the key. And you said it. It's they're filing these suits for political reasons. I mean, it reminds me of the suits, to say, everyone should be people in our state should be able to smoke if they want, right? When some of the anti-tobacco laws were coming out. And so, legally, those suits might not have much impact, but they certainly will delay everything until we get to the election. And the election will probably decide it.
I assume there's also going to be an onslaught of PR campaigns, lobbying, money given to candidates from the petroleum industry.
Absolutely. But Biden's got one ace in the hole in this. If I read it correctly, one of the auto companies, Stellantis, said that it would voluntarily just do this anyway. And then it was going to make a move in that direction. And that's a great PR move for Stellantis, right? Because one, it puts pressure on the other automakers to do the same thing, right? Because suddenly Stellantis will be known for having cleaner cars. But it also sends a message to Trump and the Republicans that, you can come in and you can wipe out the law, but we're going to do it anyway. So it was interesting that the Biden team had lined that up before they announced it.
So the UAW in general backs Democrats. This complicates a problem for them because in general, when you build electric cars, you don't need as many people in the plant. It's not like they're trying to save money by not employing people in car plants at the big auto companies. It's the number of parts in these cars is lower, so the number of people you need in the plant is lower. I mean, the UAW is at some levels like apoplectic about this, but I don't know that they can do much.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, for the UAW, having to build cars with better emission standards is probably a good thing. They still have to build them, right? It's the burden is going to be on the auto employers, right, who have to shift everything and pay more costs to meet those standards. Somewhere in the Biden strategy war room, someone is calculating the value of the youth vote by putting through these climate proposals versus the potential loss of some of the UAW vote and coming up with a positive calculation. But, that's just cold, hard politics. I think, for the UAW, they don't want a world that's all electric vehicles, but they wouldn't mind a world that's hybrid or a world that just has to shift emission standards.
So let's be realistic for a second. Young people don't tend to vote, and we don't know for sure whether young people will vote the climate. I understand in polls they say the climate's important to them. And so Biden is trying to appeal to this group of voters, but is it really a group of voters there's any large numbers?
There hasn't been, to my recollection, at least in the US, any major identifiable block of voters showing climate as their number one concern. Everybody lists it when the young people list it as a concern. But, for instance, when we had the midterm elections, there was an identifiable block of anti-abortion, of abortion voters, who were upset with the Supreme Court ruling last year. That was identifiable. We haven't seen that in climate in this country. We've seen it in others. So maybe Biden and his strategists are counting on that emerging. They're trying to find ways to define Biden from Trump in a way that young people will understand. And this is obviously a way. But the larger problem of younger voters feeling disenfranchised and concerned about the age of both the candidates is still there.
Let's look at the market share for a moment. You've got gas cars, you've got hybrids, you've got EVs. A year ago, the belief was hybrids really nobody cared about. They were all going to eventually get an EV. And that, people would say, well, I want an EV. It costs less money to drive around and all this sort of stuff. Today, hybrids are highly popular. EVs are not. And gas-powered cars is where the car companies are still going to make all of their money. So ultimately, isn't this consumer-driven? I understand you can put regulations into effect and everything else, but the car companies cannot force feed us to drive EVs.
They can't. So it is ultimately, for it to be successful, it's going to have to be consumer-driven. Again, the car companies, if they have to comply with these regulations, that's going to cost them in adjusting their emission standards for the products they're putting out, and it will probably push them into creating more lines of hybrids. But they're not going to have as much revenue. They're going to have higher costs and lower revenue if consumers continue to balk at electric vehicles. I mean, electric vehicle sales aren't slowing down. The rate is slowing down. So it's not like they're reversing or anything, but it's going to take a lot longer to shift the public, the market share you just described towards the EV majority, even with regulations like this.
So Biden has had this as a long-term goal. If you want to go back a few administrations when it comes to, mileage, not EV based, but it was a long-term goal of the Democrats. Was there a big strategic error made by the Democrats over time not to help build out a charging structure across the country instead of letting, the private companies try to do it, which is the capital expense is massive?
Yeah, it's a good question, Doug. There probably was. The private companies have had trouble doing it. Like you said, it's a massive capital cost. There's different types of charging stations and high speed, low speed, that type of stuff. Tesla seems to be kind of in the lead, and a lot of other EV makers are following Tesla using its charging stations. Ultimately, it probably will end up being private networks. Like we have private networks of gas stations now owned by the oil companies and others and franchises. But it would have been nice to have a little more, chicken before the egg or egg before the chicken as EVs caught fire, to have, make it a little easier with a decent charging network. We'll get there, but it's going to take a while.
Well, ultimately, it seems to me like the next gate here is the election, that everything we've read about in the newspapers, lawsuits, plans. If Biden loses the White House, it seems to me that this announcement was interesting. It was on the front pages everywhere, but I don't think it goes anywhere after that.
Right. Well, Trump basically said day one he's going to be a dictator, right? And that what he means, I think, is he's going to immediately order all of the Biden climate efforts that he can change. He's going to immediately overturn them, among several other things. So, this will be among his priority targets, I imagine.
Well, we'll both be back after the election to discuss this again. In the meantime, I don't see any other points on the road that make this thing work.
No, other than if other automakers start to fall in line. I mean, look, California has more stringent requirements. Trump tried to overturn them and couldn't. And so most of the automakers who sell in the US want to sell in California. So they're pushing in that direction anyway. If others join Stellantis, it's possible we'll start to see a movement, but this EPA rule is not going to force anybody to make any changes, at least before the election.
Well, we will return to this subject over and over again. Good to see you from London, and thanks for the time.
All right.